Chapter 11. Over the years that followed, the detail of what Grace saw in Mobius on their many adventures only add to her suspicion that there was more to both 87 and Mobius than ego and daydreams, though sanity demanded she not entertain that idea often. Despite that, their time together developed much of her outlook, and the seemingly impossible had begun to appear ever so simple, so as to seem obvious, like particle-wave duality and quantum tunneling. Living things were hybrids, physical particles and waves interacting in both the physical and non-physical realms, using both matter and synapses to parse information, allowing people to pass from one to the other through their biological transistor, the human mind. It certainly seemed a transistor of sorts, enabling a seamless transition between the two, allowing individuals to escape their bond particles and travel as waves along the lattice of Mobius, something they did daily, albeit subconscious or asleep. She found it ironic that they were perhaps most awake when they were asleep, and more asleep when they were awake and fixed to one position and perspective, attached to these particles which distort space-time. To think these ideas were from her seemed ridiculous, though the alternative was far more unnerving. She quickly decided that little good could come from dwelling on semantics, so instead chose to simply enjoy her imagination. It was a saving grace, an oasis she could retreat to, helping her understand a world that made little sense as it stood. A world in which you couldn't trust what you saw or what you were told. A world in which information seemed to be forever at odds with observable fact, and where monsters tore at you from within those you trusted. From an early age, her world had been small and incredibly dark at times. But Mobius and 87 had opened a door, let in some light. Since Inter had been established, it had drawn her close to the Civil War and the troubles they'd faced. Dad's job allowing them this comfortable but small house in the first, which, although wonderful, meant he often worked very long hours. The little time left over he spent with them. Gaming with Resnick or discussing big ideas with Grace, who by now was completely taken with quantum physics, theories of entanglement and general relativity to name a few. But in between these brief golden moments, Grace and her older brother were left home with Mum. She didn't realize it back then, but this first authority figure had come to live forever in her mind as a stark warning about self-proclaimed moral virtue, victimhood, and the nature of power. Grace's mother, Erin, was incredibly beautiful, with an exotic face and long dark hair, a stark contrast to Grace's red curls, green eyes, and pale complexion. Her earliest memory was of incredible pain. When sleeping, Grace would at times find herself back in that dark place, unable to breathe in such pain. It felt as though the inside of her face was burning, hot and cold simultaneously, and she had no sense of smell. She was alone. It was dark, and she was crying, a nauseating sickness welling up. She couldn't recall what had happened, just the pain and a knowing that she was alone, and with it, this strange sense she was not. An inhuman peace had blanketed her. Its warmth not only removed pain and discomfort, but she felt it fizzing through her veins. She felt renewed, clean. As an infant, she could remember being marched to her room underarm and thrown against the wall before dropping to her bed, watching the door slam shut to her cries. She'd often be forced into a dark room for hours on end in the middle of the day, and although, as she got older, the door was rarely locked, the penalty for coming out was a beating. It wasn't all bad, though. At times like these, peering through a small crack in the curtains and watching others play in the hot sun, Grace would dive into glorious pools of her imagination, swimming onto adventures that would transport her around the world to foreign shores she called home. A bit like James and the giant peach, Grace mused, sinking into her pillow on one such occasion, being stuck on the hill, watching the world below. 87 had popped up beside her on Playmont Beach, overlooking golden sands and crystal waves of Jersey Island's coastline, where her imagination had swept. To a time before things had dried up and waters became acidic. The simple, the natural, the beautiful captured a dreamlike world she longed for. Its harmony of normality sang to her in a way that only those deprived of such could hear. A notion she digested often, and like a body long starved of nutrition, just the scent of something real lit every nerve, woke every cell in her. Glancing over blue waters and the network of caves in mind, she sat them in the cafe overlooking the beach, cakes of all types, and peppermint tea swirling into formation to decorate their sea view table. James wasn't so lucky, she ventured, contrasting situations. Well, 87's head tilt in amusement. His mother was eaten alive by a rhinoceros. That's not funny. It is when you think about it, he shrugged rather unsympathetically. A rhinoceros is the symbol of kindness, gentleness, and tolerance, as well as the need to exercise your powers of perception. Like your mother in the Troubles, it ate them alive. I'm surprised you don't find it ironic that Dahl used such a means for his protagonist's kind and tolerant parents' untimely demise, the result of being caught off guard by such a beast. Grace thought on it. The rhino had struck her as an odd choice, but come to think of it, in hindsight, it was almost prophetic. Her mind drifted over how the troubles arose before resting on Mum. She'd often professed to be all those things her actions could not reflect. She knew it wasn't malicious, that Mum was almost like that rhino, that she could have been all those wonderful things if it were not for the fact she was out of her element, panicked. Her mind raced to other oddities of his novel. The magic worms? Perception well used provides insight that's rather like magic, allows things without voice to speak. Those magic worms changed the nature of those they found. They spilt out, sharing ability never intended for those who received them. It led to unnatural relationships, chaos, and disorder, but a happy ending nonetheless. He eyed her curiously as a smile grew on his handsome face. What else did you notice? He watched her mind race over the mechanical shark, autonomous technology and AI, like a beast that rose up, out of the depths of chaos, James and his friends battling it back. He was prepared to sacrifice himself to save his friends. Beings considered little more than pests to most, but who behaved far more human than the people around him. Grace thought on it a while. Come to think of it, all his stories artfully underpinned the need for a closer look, and the idea that things are seldom as they seem, that not all adults could be trusted, and words could be very deceiving to those who weren't paying close enough attention. Danny Champion of the World ends with a plea for children to grow into lively, cheerful, and high-spirited parents. The stuff all good futures are made of. 87 smiled thoughtfully down at the cakes but never ate. Instead, he continued, whispering secrets of Dahl, this ex-spy and fiction writer, who, although exists in their world, had lived predominantly in one few others ever realized, distilling truths woven to the tales he told, ones a child could absorb and extrapolate, truths from a world completely unseen by most and yet formed their very climate, a place he spent most of his time. Its secrets seeped through pages, passing on perception and intuition, helping children make sense of a world that at times seemed completely at odds with observable fact. The twits show in simple terms the power of psychology, 87 volunteered. How subtle incremental changes, mind games, are able to steer people and populations, enough to turn even the tyrant puppeteers themselves on their heads. To look like a pair of twits? Grace grinned, recalling the ending. What about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Chapter 12. Now that's an interesting one. 87 mused over Willy Wonka and his chocolate factory as sea blue eyes cast out the window. A very successful, eccentric businessman, childlike in some ways, the best in his field, developing technologies no one thought possible, throwing a bone to those in society and launching people in glass houses into space, eventually saving America from aggressive, illegal aliens and inadvertently trapping Charlie's loved ones in Minusland. Their lives shrunk down in pursuit of a youthful avatar. Notice, Dahl wrote it years before that Musk surfaced and VR rolled out. Events are scripted for those who step into Mobius and outside of time to view the living archive, while its adventure breathes new life into the older generation. And Matilda? Shows the magical power of knowledge, one not determined by age, as well as a power we don't fully understand, one that doesn't follow genetic lines, but manifests during times of injustice. In that book, he gives a comprehensive reading list for thinkers to get started, introducing them to the minds of George Orwell, Graham Greene, and others who encourage the mind into playful exercise and the reader into a deep love of critical thinking. Humanity, love, political artistry, privilege, and purpose. Putting down his fork, 87's fingers steepled from where his elbows rested on the driftwood table. There are few things more powerful than the stories we tell ourselves. Trunchbull illustrates with such artistry, humor, and brutal accuracy the tyrannical forces that exist and how they present themselves that I can think of no better meme. From their brutish behavior behind closed doors that's so extreme, no reasonable adult would believe it to be true, to her name, Ms. Smallpost and Ball. Anything but total compliance is met with extreme and out of proportion force, using that fear, social pressure, and public humiliation to impose their will. Trunchbull's a murderer who killed the father figure and frames it as suicide. She is anti-marriage, anti-children, and anti-logic, claiming that, in that school, she is God. 87 smirked. Well, perhaps she, along with all tyrants, overestimate their reach as well as the forces they're contending with, along with the notion that I think therefore I am, with I say, therefore I am. Grace gave a thoughtful nod. Like the political leaders in Sometime Never, his fable for supermen. Only the worm remained in the end. All humans dead from wars they were fooled into fighting. Not even the worm, the parasite orchestrating it, was satisfied with that outcome. How could it be? After all, it wasn't after their extinction. It was after them and their children, farming them, consuming them, using them to propagate. Nurturing an environment for the parasite to thrive. 87 watched reruns of The Faculty flicker through her mind. Ever wonder why they tried recalling those books? Censoring them? A wide smirk lined his handsome face. You haven't scratched the surface of what he hid between those pages. Not even close. He leant in, but to Grace's disappointment, she heard her bedroom door bump open into the foot of the bed. Felt consciousness rise on the tide that welled between them in the cafe, washing her back to her bed, the room exploding with light as Mum flung back curtains. It wasn't until a few days later that their conversation on parasites resurfaced, when 8-year-old Grace found herself staring up at what no longer appeared to be her mother. Pinned tightly under one arm, Mum had pinched her nose hard till Grace gasped for air, only to have a bar of soap forced into her mouth. It clipped her lip, blood and ivory suds frothing up the back of her throat. Anything could set Mum off. It could be something that was said, something that wasn't said, a look, a missing book, a dream Mum had, or because you're just like your father. Only the outcome was reliably the same, and, in a sense, that brought some comfort. This degree of predictability. Looking back, Grace realized it was just Mum's way of coping, of stemming or deflating the buildup of uncontrollable rage, frustration, and disappointment that built up inside of her, like a balloon of nails, threatening to explode even more violently if deprived of an outlet. But as Grace grew up, verbal onslaughts began to replace the physical violence she experienced at home. Blaming and shaming overtook the beatings, forced isolation, and other unsavory punishments. In a way, Grace found them harder to deal with. Physical violence was over quick, the damage and need for time to heal, clear. But verbal onslaughts would last hours, if not days, and grew more dramatic over the years. Worse, those words were like poison and took root. Anger's a door to your heart through which monsters pass, 87 once warned. Guard it, weed out those roots, or you'll become like her. As the years rolled by and Grace grew up, Mum's outbursts became more reserved for Dad. She'd shout, hit, and chase him up the stairs to throw scalding tea over him. Between VR lessons, Grace heard Mum with a friend. If I'd have had a gun, I'd have shot him. With Mum, walking away made things worse. Answering her questions made things worse. Agreeing with her made things worse. And staying quiet made it worse. The sad truth of the matter is that her outbursts had happened for so long, the level of violence increasing so gradually as to seem normal. It wasn't all bad, you see. Mum really loved them. She would go out of her way to cook healthy meals, heavily support education, and she was fiercely protective over them. If something was wrong, she would fix it. If someone else put them at risk, she would protect them. So Grace grew up navigating a world of inversions, anticipating the unpredictable, becoming extremely perceptive and near expert at the mental gymnastics required to survive at home. Much of the time, she'd complete the daily assault course of emotional landmines, swim through verbal sloughs, coming up for air in her imagination around beautiful ideas and thoughts of great minds. Those minds challenged her, and those challenges saw momentum. Momentum that moved her in the opposite direction of this dismal situation. As she reached secondary school, she joined clubs, avoiding home where possible, and soaking up life's beauty from books. Everything comes so easily for you, not like the rest of us, her mother ground out over breakfast. Not all of us are born with confidence and a figure. Just wait till you turn 30 or have kids. Then you'll lose it all, you'll see. Because babies are born with confidence and a figure. 87 drawled in mock amusement at Grace's efforts to square away these cyclical arguments, though to his annoyance, nothing he said seemed to help. So, eat junk, he snapped. Don't exercise. Moan incessantly so you don't risk your health or happiness offending others. Because that, he raised a theatrical brow, will make the world a better place. Over time, with his tough love, Grace had become quite resilient. There was, however, no denying the fact that growing up like this left a significant mum-shaped hole. There were glimmers of how things were meant to be, in books, in the relationships she watched her friends enjoy. They offered hope. Protect your heart. The notion surfaced from what seemed nowhere and everywhere, its echo firming her lips as she reflected on the miserable state of the thing. Well, if imagination was key, she was fairly well placed to fix it up a little, she supposed. Mobius could reanimate the past, activate her subconscious, and help reflect. Perhaps it could even offer a little closure. From where she now lay on her bed in the first, emerald eyes glazed with determination and squeezed shut, wrinkling freckles that dust her nose, her imagination, while wildly untamable, could bend. Determined, Grace walled off her mind and sank into calculations, watching networks and coordinates spiral in the vortex of consciousness as she imagined positions and patterns of perspective. She could feel the mortise locks of her mind turn like a kaleidoscope, falling into place, connecting everything to Mobius. When she opened her eyes, to her surprise, she could actually see herself lying there on the bed, from where she now floated, out of her body, a thin amethyst haze undulating around it, like a sheath around a cable which she'd collapsed into. String of theory, she mused. Grace could see why 87 referred to it as a living tapestry. Its contents moved as if it were a living, breathing organism. Rosen bridge threads connecting physical and metaphysical. Threads of energy from what is, reaching through every quark inside every atom, its sheath barely visible using advanced technology, its circumference a fine vibrating string. Grace left the shell of her body where it lay on her bed and sank into the breathable depths of Mobius. As she moved through space and time, she felt completely connected to everyone and everything, bursting with energy. She felt it, the call. It was only a whisper, but it was strong. To come home, to stay. Everything here in this place felt right, felt good. She flew playfully through the abyss, completely free, untouchable. The faster she went, the stronger the vibration she felt, her charge, direction, and speed, manifesting a sort of reaction, a new unwritten combination, like some innovative form of music, its melody rippling in the rainbow of variants she splashed in. Emotion and motion, dancing like water and light, beautifully intoxicating till she spun to a halt and watched raw fractals fizz out. Chapter 13. Rimmed with gold, 87's eyes smoldered, skimming over Grace. She seemed oblivious to the danger she was in. He'd seen firsthand how many had lost their minds here. Most of the samples they'd lost early on had gone that way. Untethered, conscious connection, though limitless in its freedoms, proved dangerous to the inexperienced. Exploration here without tethering to some physical form saw many venture too far and lose their way back. Others, caught in the riptide of this living tapestry, were unable to contend with its current and gave up, their energy reabsorbed. Sleep at least activated certain tethers, and though limiting, it provided a reasonable safety net. Yet here she was, his tongue-rimmed strong white teeth, remarkably unscathed, playing between savage undercurrents of Mobius, completely oblivious, completely unfazed, and disconcertingly mesmerizing. His eyes pinched on her where she spun. Samples did exceed organics, he supposed, and she was one of them, technically, even if she'd been given an inhibitor. His jaw firmed. She was also Morgan's tool, an obstacle for him to overcome, and a puzzle to solve, to secure their freedom, their future. If she had it, it was only a matter of time before she unknowingly led him to it, in here. His thoughts stuck on their source code, the missing answer to freedom and lasting power. But a warm smile soon tugged at his sardonic expression, seeing Grace light the space, painting it with exuberance and enchanting warmth. Her legato of moves lively, funny. The allegro of lyric, what a feeling, radiate from her flash dance. Play was not something samples at Inter were accustomed to, nor was it a characteristic shared, respected, or encouraged, and yet watching her felt oddly satisfying, incredibly amusing, and he stiffened uncomfortably, unsettlingly beautiful. Asterisk. As Grace stilled, closing her mind's eye, she flopped back into the energy on which she drifted, sailing past lifelines and the many doors in Mobius, till something outside of it grabbed at her. A book of all things. Wading back against the current, she clung to the door that it reached through and found herself peering into an old English hallway. There it was. It didn't look anything special and lay on a sideboard below a narrow, wrought iron mirror. Such a curious thing, she mused, moving closer. To know the entirety of a thing through mere proximity, its information distilled to a knowing. It was as though it had connected to her, become part of her own thinking, feeling, and experience. Why and how this happened, she wasn't sure. But looking at it, though the book wasn't striking in appearance, she could feel its words connect to truths in the living tapestry. In the first, books were rare, and written language had begun to die out, viewed largely as an outdated and an inefficient way of transferring data. But this book, the Sumerian Kings List, felt different. Its words on a page, like cells in a body, Grace could feel them, embody its people. Their fears, passions, and thoughts flit through as though her own. It looked so ordinary and yet woke every particle. The lives inside, though sharp in contrast, rang out in harmony where they clashed. Personality and perspective behind word, colored motive and action, breathing life into them, into her. These otherworldly beings took woman, produced fruit that altered original code, and laid challenge to fundamental order. They passed on divine knowledge never intended for humans, creating destructive talents and dangerous appetites in their descendants that scaled. Their love of mankind, the advantage these deities sought to provide for their loved ones, and legacy which saw them overstep fundamental order, ironically seeding the very thing that would ensure their untimely demise, entropy. Their descendants continued in their father's footsteps, following their own appetites which scaled, climaxing in unimaginable horror. Grace couldn't think of a worse curse for those who sought legacy and to protect and prosper their family line, than to have it perish entirely as a result of their own efforts. It was jarring. Reaching out of Mobius, she instinctively tried to pick it up, though she realized she had no hands to do so. The book, however, moved as though an extension of herself and floated as though held. The scream of its owner caught her by surprise. The woman looked in horror at the book, which appeared to float, until Grace dropped it and shrank back into Mobius. She felt awful for frightening the woman, and although over, the scenario had left a bizarre feeling, as though the eyes of the world had turned in on her. While the room had been empty, but for the two of them, the woman's scream seemed to have drawn the attention of something profound. She felt as though she were in trouble, had broken some innate rule and thought it best to return to her body. But as she muddled her way back, trying to retrace her steps, something else caught her eye. A place that looked completely foreign and yet chillingly familiar. A lab full of pods containing young children. From behind the curtain of space and time, Grace tried to make out the markings on these peculiar pods. Asterisk. Curious little devil, 87's jaw firmed. She'd somehow found the lab containing his former self and the other samples. While he needed her to explore Mobius and loosen her grip on the source code, on where it hid away in her, it wouldn't do to have her stumble across the real reason he'd found her. Not now, not when he was so close. A little distraction was in order. From where he'd been watching, 87 wrenched open one of many circular doors that lined the vast corridors of Mobius, its current funneling energy, strong enough to drag her through. Standing aside, he watched the riptide carry her out, waves crashing onto the ancient shores of Syracuse, the great city of Greece. One moment she had been weightless, swimming through Mobius. The next, Grace found herself coughing up seawater and fishing seaweed out of her hair. Hair! She stared at her hands. They felt incredibly heavy. She had hands. A body? Not in Mobius. It can't be. Another wave buffeted her, tumbling the skinny bundle of arms and legs over before she managed to stumble ashore. Spluttering, she grabbed the outstretched hand on offer, only to stare up into the piercing blue eyes of an all-too-familiar presence, one that for the first time looked human. 87 stood there expressionless, dwarfing her, and for a moment she wasn't quite sure if it were Mobius or the wave that tumbled her senses. Fighting with the stubborn piece of kelp in her hair, she frowned back. He seemed to appear at the worst possible time, strong and flawless, making her feel ridiculous in comparison. A regular knight in shining armor, he offered, pulling her from the water. Outdated! Her grim expression eased to a smile. And with all the wrong equipment? But her amusement evaporated as she returned to the seaweed, nodding her hair. Not very gracious today, are we? He smirked. She wasn't exactly sure how or when it happened, but as he neared, her outfit dried, her hair suddenly kelp-free, without a tangle. It's never without tangles. Grace's mouth thinned on these implausible details, annoyed at her sloppy imagination. Welcome to Syracuse. His handsome gaze shuddered where it washed over her, flying them overhead through the ancient city. Home to the Antikythera, one of many machines by Archimedes. His brow furrowed, catching her fleeting thoughts on him before turning to this ancient city. The siege of Syracuse. He continued with considerable effort. Archimedes created many machines to help protect them. He moved them over city walls where she pulled away to have a closer look and to gain some much-needed distance from this imaginary superhero of sorts. What she saw was the culmination of the seizure of Syracuse. Walls fell as Romans flooded the city. Much was destroyed, and Archimedes sat locked in his chamber, working studiously, even as the soldiers stormed through. Unaware of who he was, they demanded he go with them. She watched in horror as this poor old man sat on the floor, fighting to protect the dust with his hands. Do not disturb my circles, he pleaded. Grace made to intervene, but 87 wouldn't allow it. You can't change the past, he shrugged. Can't imagine what you'd change. She snapped back, watching the old man who fought bravely to return to his drawings of dust, drawings from a dream. But the soldier struck him again. He lay bloodied and dying, sobbing, pleading with them. Don't disturb my circles. Glossy green eyes narrowed on 87, who stood, still blocking her path. Wouldn't have made a difference, he shrugged. It would have to me. Though he said nothing, his gaze softened somewhat. What about the future? Can we see it? Change it? She breathed once it was over. We can glimpse outlines. New lives define detail. Conscious choice creates an alignment and interaction between the physical and metaphysical, allowing a permanent symmetry to exist between the two, a fusion of sorts. Though it's not exactly that straightforward. Grace looked more closely at the circles of dust the old man had drawn. Mobius? 87 relinquished a curt nod. He saw the writing on the wall years before the Roman siege, tried to build the ultimate defense for Syracuse, a device that could use Mobius, manage infinite computations, allowing changes to the past, time travel, the Antikythera. Ironic, really. Grace sobered. What is? He didn't recognize the pattern or manage to avoid its cycle either. He gave his life to protect a creation he hoped to realize one day. Seems noble, she shrugged, but 87's mouth soured. Seems an oversight. Emerald eyes glittered their objection. What greater treasure is there to find than someone or something that's worth your everything? 87 let out a reluctant sigh. There is a poetry, a comedy, and symmetry to that, he admitted. It seemed to reverberate through to the very essence of what is. His mouth firmed, assessing the indisputable pattern of fundamentals in relation to Grace. Morgan was good, He'd give her that. Chapter 14. The next morning, Grace's puzzle box clicked into action, its plates moving apart, a small rotator whirring up before it flew wildly round the room, alarms sounding with irritating bleeps and blops, impossible to catch or ignore. Surfacing from her dream, Grace felt as though she'd come to know 87, this ego of hers, a personality of its own, making her ever more curious as to how her mind could paint in such vivid detail. Things she never knew. Rubbing tired eyes, Grace rummaged in a drawer beside her bed as the alarm continued. Pulling out her latest gadget, a small electromagnetic pulse shot out toward the drone that fizzed and crackled as it fell, unfortunately landing on its charge port, sending a pulse through the mains and flipping the circuit board, briefly knocking out power in the house before it auto-reset. Pottering down to the kitchen, a blanket of light flickered into action as power returned, draping light over their hydroponic wall and sleek countertops. "You do know we have things that will do that for you." Her brow rose with a warm smile, watching Dad rustle up some breakfast. He was overworked as it was, but he smiled and continued. Although busy, he didn't just make time for menial tasks, he turned them into moments. Something precious, lasting. "Then what would I do with myself?" "Oh, I don't know," she mused, smiling at the green tea that print. "Get some sleep?" Virtually everything could run automatically at home, from meal prep, security, cleaning, to heating and lighting. But Dad preferred to do it himself, given half a chance, much to Mum's annoyance. Right now, the smell of warm, buttered toast and smoked salmon wafted over, and Poppy, their little Roblox assistant, spun about at her feet, whirling up crumbs. It was Grace's favorite setting, and though Mum couldn't abide pets, the family setting included a puppy feature. Not even Aaron could say no to that. A pet that left the house clean and more hygienic than before. Even she'd become incredibly fond of Poppy. Grace perched at the kitchen island, tucking into Eggs Benedict, which Dad had plated up, their little robotic pup mopping up under her feet, while Dad topped his own with a final sprinkle of chives. "There," he smiled, standing back to admire it. Grace watched steam dance up, her thoughts twirling round with 87's. He gave his life to protect his creation. There's a poetry and symmetry to it all. There's no point. Refine your own code. Everything and nothing you do matters here. Reverse component iterations. Her mouth firmed. "What's troubling you?" Dad's eyes puzzled over his little girl, having note the furrow lining her brow. "You don't have to do it, the audition. I know it's not your thing." The audition. Thoughts of 87 flew out the window. Lord, she forgot about that. "Grace? It makes her happy." Grace shrugged, tucking into breakfast. "Not much makes her happy these days. Besides, Mum was taking an interest in her, and in truth, Grace liked that." She noticed Dad pale, adjusting his hearing aid. "If the interference is that bad, you should take it back. Get it looked at," she offered, watching his shoulders forcibly ease. It didn't happen often, but when interference came through on that thing, she could see how it rattled him. "Takes a bit of getting used to, that's all." His usual warmth flooded back, along with his original point. "Make sure it doesn't interfere with your studies." He paused, realizing that wasn't what threatened to distract her. Perhaps it was to be expected, normal even. High-functioning individuals were often highly focused on one thing. Hell, he could hardly talk. Thiel Corp now consumed most of his waking hours. Besides, there was no harm indulging the odd daydream while she had the time for it, he supposed. "Where you up to?" But Grace seemed lost in thought. "The Mobius equation. Any progress?" Michael asked with a smile. Just the mention of the word was enough to pull Grace back in the room. There was no doubt about it. She certainly had his ever-inquisitive engineering mind, though it seemed largely consumed with daydreams. "You solved it." His eyes sparkled with humor. "It's not so much solving it as understanding it." Michael tucked into his own breakfast. "The real difficulty," he managed between large mouthfuls, "wouldn't be bending time. In theory, Mobius does that for you." He looked up, gaze far off in a look Grace was very familiar with. "But once the wormhole is open, how do you stabilize it long enough to get back?" That would be the sticking point. Wouldn't want to get stuck now. He threw her a wink and returned to his Eggs Benedict. Oh, to have the time for daydreaming all things quantum. Grace had perhaps a little too much. Finishing his plate, he popped it in the sink and watched its smart material dissolve and filter through to the cupboard below, where the plate, now clean, had reformed. "Call me old-fashioned," he muttered, disapproving eyes having left the plate. "But I prefer the old days and my old ways." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, hearing her echo along. "You would too, if you were there." He finished with a chuckle, watching her gestures lovingly mirror his own. Oh, to be so predictable, in both a personal and a generational sense. He wasn't sure what to make of that, though from Grace's expression, it seemed to be a good thing. With a sigh, he began rearranging his things for work. He'd be home today, unless something unexpected popped up. There was much to be done, and it'd save a few minutes on the commute. Not that commutes were particularly long in the first. Travel pods were compact private transport vehicles, programmed for time optimization and to avoid accidents, using insulated high-powered magnetic lines, and those at Inter had priority travel. While things were far from perfect, progress came quick in times of crisis, and that's precisely where they'd been living for quite some time now. Crisis, it seemed, had become the new norm. "I thought about that," Grace nodded, considering the wormhole. She sat there as if a work colleague, head thoughtfully off to one side. Negative mass, in theory, would naturally stabilize the wormhole. "Oh, and you have some of that lying around, do you?" Michael smiled, taking a sip of coffee. Despite all the advancements he'd witnessed over the past few years, they were still yet to establish whether negative mass truly exists outside of speculative theories. In light of recent events, it had hardly been at the top of R&D's priority. "We all do." Grace sat up. "Life isn't just atoms and particles, or particles and waves, subject to the person observing or measuring them, Dad. Negative mass, or a soul if you want to call it that, knits together and solves the most complicated puzzles of the universe. Entanglement, the uncertainty principle." Grace's arms floated about, illustrating her chain of thought. "It encapsulates the very laws of our universe." She hesitated as Dad's skeptical brow rose. "I think. You're saying our mind is the device bridging classical mechanics with quantum?" "The original. Think of those old mobile phones as a dumbed-down version, a physical structure with mechanical components, one that uses quantum mechanics." "It does?" Dad laughed. "Neurons and synapses in the brain, a more advanced form of semiconductors and transistors in a phone. Even our display technology, our eyes for example, use organic compounds. Light emission and absorption depending on electron transitions between energy states. When we use our mind, we're able to access Mobius. Open doors to allow consciousness to pass through, navigate uncharted territory in our universe, to travel in a way that only subatomic particles can." Her mind stuck on Syracuse where, under 87's observation, they had manifest out of a superposition of sorts into a single state. "Wave function collapse." She smiled. It was starting to make sense. Well, as much as nonsense could, she mused. "And the Mobius strip," Dad was now rubbing his brow. "You say it bends time?" "Bends eternity, this never-ending loop. Negative mass, or our soul, is the missing link to understanding the monster group and quantum weirdness, as well as measuring position accurately within it. There's a whole lot of unproven theory there, Grace. Where all great discoveries start." She grinned. The arch in Dad's brow seemed to have risen so high as to now be stuck. He couldn't work out if she were joking. "You realize there's nothing concrete to support it. Overlooked is not the same as unsupported. Grace, if it were true, I'd have noticed it." "You have." Michael looked amused by the idea. "My soul, popping from one place in the universe, in time to another, in an instant. I haven't noticed that." "You have." Dad gave what seemed a sympathetic look. He must have thought her stark raving mad. "How did you sleep? Were your dreams strange compared to the reality when you're awake? Did those 8 hours of sleep pass in the blink of an eye? Like some twin paradox? Do you sometimes get that falling feeling before you jolt awake in your body? Take time to adjust after you wake, a bit like travel lag. If someone who had never slept experienced it for the first time, they would not consider it normal. this otherworldly place, like something out of a Dali painting or a glimpse of 4D from a 3D processor. Still sounds like superstitious nonsense to me. The kind of thing early scientists were burnt at the stake for. That's a little different. I don't see how. Some people, some of those incredibly bright minds you mentioned, did make powerful connections between the laws of nature and the universe which others didn't understand. Frightened people attacked it. Others labeled it superstitious nonsense. It's the same today for quantum weirdness. But we can't learn anything new until we accept there are things that exist which we haven't yet made sense of. If what you're proposing is true, and that's a big if Grace, we'd feel that negative mass at work interacting inside us day to day. Something trying to connect or repel, mix it up or charge it. It wouldn't just disappear when we wake up. You've felt it. The push and pull of relationships, of chemistry and conscience and instinct, a sense of danger or belonging. We haven't been able to explain it in scientific terms, so we've given it other names like attraction, gut feeling, chemistry, intuition, sense. There'd be more substance to it than instinct and chemistry. More substance to the immaterial and metaphysical? Grace smiled at the idea. And what about music? Music? Grace gave a nod. Musicians are in a sense coders of normal and negative mass, aligning the two in a dance of sorts. Sound waves aren't confined by gravity, and when two opposing forms of matter meet, it creates a sort of romance, an atmosphere where these two opposites pair up in a playful, patterned push and pull. Musicians are able to get listeners to access parts of the brain tasked with complex math, and in seconds recode their thoughts or feeling, altering brain chemistry and a person's sense of alignment at that moment. They can create mass alignment of people or nodes on a large scale. Michael remained silent. In truth, he hadn't given it much thought, and it certainly wasn't his area of expertise. The foundation for a sound theory's there, she grinned at her dad joke. Still, if an external source, a musician, can utilize our mind, recode our negative mass, alter brain chemistry and our physical state, just think what we can do from the inside. The corner of Michael's mouth twisted to a smile as he watched his daughter's mind churn with infinite possibilities, bridging subatomic particles, quantum entanglement to bending time. Even if we have found the missing link allowing us to bridge the two, if we contain negative mass, there's no way to know if time and space conform to the principles of a Rosen bridge. My dear, not yet. But he couldn't deny the idea intrigued him. She could see it, unconvinced, but intrigued. It frustrated her that, even now during a time of hypergrowth and development, the brightest minds still focused on developing clunky traditional materials, rather than studying things nature perfected hundreds of years ago to develop more efficient and beneficial systems. From photosynthesis and their own less than impressive solar power storage solutions to their clunky glass hydrodome that now replaced their once protective atmosphere. But that was all they had time for as Mum stormed in. Chapter 15. Blasted power cut. Reset my alarm. If this is what the first is like, Lord help your mother in the third. Grace watched Dad's expression fall. I wouldn't visit God himself in that place, Mum continued, waiting for her coffee to print. It's not that bad, Grace insisted, but Mum didn't seem to notice the weight of her words. You are joking, right? Soon as you cross the border, you're assailed by that cold, damp musk. That place has a smell you can't wash off, soaks into your pores. She shuddered. Everything that side of the wall is broken. You have to wait at least 20 minutes for a transport pod, and then you have to share it with at least 50 other unwashed, unkempt, ominous-looking, masked strangers, each as filthy as the next. They shouldn't be allowed into the first. There's no telling the lengths desperate people will go to. Besides, there's not a single job these roadblocks can't do. Completely unnecessary to have them here at all. Makes me feel unsafe, she scoffed. Then there's the noise of those masks. I can't understand a word they say. Thank God we don't have to wear them here. Erin sipped her coffee before glancing up at them. Oh, come on. You're both thinking it. Once you get to that poky little shipping container, you have to climb 15 flights of stairs, if you can call it that. More of a fire escape, if you ask me. No. Thank God for VR visitation. She says it keeps her young. Grace shrugged. Gran did have a youthful sparkle and bounce in her step. Not even hypothermia will finish her off. Mum sipped at her coffee. I'm kidding? Course I'm kidding. Her voice trailed off. Well, at least it looks warm in that tin shack since we had insulation put in. Nursing the cup in her hands, her eyes glazed as she relived her one and only visit in horrifying detail before blinking it back. A living graveyard. She has a nice view. Of the first, Erin conceded, gaze fixed on Grace before putting down her coffee. Swanning around the kitchen island, she swept unruly red curls back from Grace's face. You could be so beautiful if you tried. Let me help you choose an outfit for the audition. I know what Silas and the team look for. Grace felt herself lean into Mum, who continued to play with her hair a moment. Have you been practicing your lines? Grace gave a nod, crumbs falling from her chin as she shoveled the rest of breakfast away, having noticed the time. You'll never fit into your dress at... Erin, Michael objected with a look of warning as she fluffed Grace's hair back up. Better put these on, she handed Grace her VR glasses. School starts soon. We're in today. They swapped days around this week for Inter's guest speakers. Then where's Resnick? Erin shrieked. How could you let him sleep in? Disapproving eyes raked over the two of them before she made for the stairs. I'm seeing Gran Monday after school, Grace offered. I can drop some stuff off if you like. Guilt still laced his expression as he handed over his carbon credit card. He didn't seem to think it enough. She knows you're doing your best for all of us. But it made little difference. Grace couldn't imagine what it must feel like to carry his level of responsibility. His company, Theo Corp, had been tasked with developing Zero, the world's only carbon-neutral energy and storage facility going forward, and had won a second tender from Inter, something top secret he wasn't able to talk about. As well as being responsible for his employees' livelihoods and Inter's ability to ensure a safe environment, Dad was the glue holding together their shaky family. One mum seemed determined to pull apart, for reasons Grace couldn't begin to understand. She watched Dad put on his VR headset and begin work before packing her own bag. In the first, they had agile working. Lessons would be held online in the metaverse 2 days a week, while the other 3 were spent in school. She liked going in. It meant they could see their friends, and Resnick enjoyed kicking a ball about. But kids in the third weren't so lucky. With resources so thin, there weren't any schools to attend there, so third kids would join lessons in the first remotely, able to observe 5 days a week, submitting any questions through AI moderators and teaching bots. Grace grabbed a croissant for Resnick, who stumbled down the stairs in a crinkled blazer. He could devour it when they were in the pod, on their way to school. Asterisk. Clambering out of the pod as humming drones whizzed overhead and dodging a droid that strode by sporting the latest fashion, Grace narrowly missed another walking advert, a projection this time, for VR headsets. Straightening herself out, she stared up at school. Harrow was an old Victorian building, crowning the hilltop. Having once been an all-boys school, it now housed both full and part-time students from the first. Bots worked tirelessly along walls and ceilings, layering 3D limestone prints, repairing damage acquired during the troubles and dust storms before Hydra. Pottering through iron begonia gates, she passed under its Latin motto, leaving behind numerous walking adverts that tried to follow, their digital IDs not permitted on school grounds. The words Stet Fortuna Domus, Donorum Die Dispensatio Fidelis, read, Let the fortunate of the house stand, the faithful stewardship of the gifts of God. A pompous contradiction at first glance, proclaiming prosperity for only the fortunate. Yet it held hidden instruction in the figurative stet to ignore the smallest meaning derived out of the statement, as well as the change between one another. The subtle linguistic alternation, simultaneously implying all were equal, all responsible, all had gifts to steward, and the need for each to stand up and be counted. To Grace, the words felt magnetic, essential for navigating this world. It seemed that for those paying close enough attention, the words stood to highlight one's own bias, allowing them to correct for such error. The words themselves, part of the gateway, like Mobius, leading Grace to wonder about its designer. Daily, students would move from one side of the fence to the other as though enacting some greater parody, something far more profound. After jogging up marble steps that cascade from Harrow's triple-arched entrance, she and Resnick hurried off in opposite directions. Although she knew school was a luxury, Harrow's external walls were far from its best. Grace had seen movies, read books, all depicting life before Hydra and the Troubles. A lot of work had been done to fix things up. They'd even replanted a few trees, a rare and precious resource now. But Hydra still felt like the life support machine it was. The premise of school, however, stood as a kaleidoscope in her mind. Though its outer shell didn't look like much, inside the majesty of endless possibility tumbled about, like precious stones, developing and decorating the halls of her mind. Though ever-changing, it remained breathtakingly beautiful in nature and housed inexhaustible creativity. Grace hurried past the iconic statue in the center of the courtyard, a willow tree made from crystal, water, and light, its opulent glass truck spouting branches, fountains at various pressures, refracting wavelengths of light in a rainbow of color for its majestic yet lifeless bow. As the bell rang for first period, Grace hurried into the changing rooms behind the fourth quadrant. She usually looked forward to PE, having loved cross-country. But not this. Not the breathless, heart-pounding fluster of arms and legs, flailing about in a panic as she threaded them into gym gear to Miss Gillingham's bellowing countdown. She seemed more short-tempered than usual, tumbling out onto the track, closely followed by the stout coach whose attire seemed to resemble more of a combat uniform. Grace jogged up to the others and fell in line. Breeze in her hair, she could once again relax, and as she ran her mind cleared, became weightless, the strings of Mobius grazing her cheek as she fell back into daydream. It was a curious thing to be running and be absolutely still at the same time, only to swim through the thoughts and perspective of another. Through Mobius, hers had returned to that peculiar, floating book she'd managed to lift, the Sumerian King's List. 87 had said changes in Mobius didn't cross over, didn't translate, but that didn't seem right. Her thoughts flowed back to poor old Archimedes. He gave his life to protect his vision, a creation he hoped to realize. As far as Grace could tell, they had it back to front. They were the creation creative energy gave itself for, the very thing they took after. While she loved creating, felt it mushrooming out of her, it seemed an overflow, and not the thing on which anything fundamental would depend. But at that, the bell rang out, steering her back toward the changing rooms. Chapter 16. At break, she moseyed over to the bench where Taylor and the others spoke excitedly in hushed tones. "You not heard," Taylor beamed, slinging her long brown hair back in a ponytail. "Teachers won't say a thing, but they all look pretty flustered, and our guest speaker today's canceled." "Could be sick," Grace offered, slumping beside her. "I don't think so. Look who's patrolling the gate." Taylor gestured to the infamous samples, the tops of their helmets just visible over the wall. "Aren't they dreamy?" Taylor gushed as Grace realized. She wasn't the only one with a good imagination. She could barely see the tops of their helmet, let alone make out what any of them looked like. They could be clumps of solder and wire for all she knew. "They're muscle." Taylor swooned, ducking the bullet of a tennis ball Grace caught just inches from her face. Glancing at the group of young lads who'd thrown it, Grace looked at Taylor to continue, keen to avoid the bemused looks of those who witnessed the catch. She could see the sample they'd been talking about had turned their way and was facing them. Kevlar and body armor glinted majestically, and to Grace it seemed he were like something out of a comic book. He held her stare, and though far off, there was something about him, something oddly familiar. Loose curls fell about her face as she shook her head. Now it was her imagination whirling out of control. The way people were still staring, she was clearly the only oddity. Thankfully, the bell rang, and scooping up her bag, Grace hurried off to English. Chaos in the classroom faded as students piled up against the window, watching the samples outside, swapping ideas as to what on earth could have brought them here. But they were quickly ushered back to their seats by a feathery young woman with a pale face, large dark eyes, and short neck. She was unconventionally pretty and always calm, though today she did seem a little flustered. Mrs. Barnes switched on the VR simulation, and students began to settle, pulling on headsets and immersing themselves in a version of the book they'd studied last week. Noise in the classroom settled as a dreamlike world submerged theirs, combining fact and fiction, with a taste of the intangible, creating something beautiful, feeding imagination. Grace had fallen in love with this story from start to finish, a Midsummer Night's Dream. her mind flooded with unanswered questions. How much control do people have over their lives? Life and dreams that seemed interconnected and interchangeable with the bizarre reality they found themselves in, both asleep and awake. How much could you really trust what you saw? How much of substance was unseen? That nonsensical behavior, so often displayed as part of the norm. And then there was the darker side of love, where the rules no longer seemed to apply and the notion that all of it was a dream. The crazy story made complete sense, opaque until the end. Third period saw them delve into maths and Grace sat completing advanced algebra. She found comfort in numbers and had already jumped a couple years. She couldn't explain it, but for a long time she'd come to find there was something about the patterns and equations, the ability to view the same thing from different angles, to grasp a more complete picture of what wasn't always obvious at first. For some time now, Grace had come to feel that understanding maths was key to understanding just about everything, and in a very practical way, it could be used to map and navigate a world with shifting tides and unexplored depth. By lunch, much of the excitement over the samples would have died down, she supposed, had it not been for the arrival of a stout, balding man that marched through the grounds to their headmaster's office. "That's Hobbs," Chico gasped. "Head of defense at Inter. Can you imagine people at our school helping to develop things on Halo? Could be us soon." "That's why he's here?" The question fell out of Grace as she strolled up to the bench. "Must be." Chico and the others continued to speculate as she took a seat beside Taylor. Biting into her sandwich, listening to her friends swoon over the samples who could still be seen patrolling the West Quadrant. Grace was taken back by chalky spores that dust up her nose, sending the sandwich tumbling back out into the Ziploc bag, where she eyed it critically. "Tell me that didn't get your heart going." An excited elbow caught Grace off guard, where it drove into her ribs. "He smiled at us. Beneath that helmet. I know he did. He keeps looking over." Taylor beamed. Grace felt sick but managed a wounded smile. Why Mum insisted on using up old moldy leftovers when they had 3D food printers, she'd never understand. "Grace?" Taylor's bright eyes fixed on her. Scratching around for something useful to add, Grace offered a shrug. "It's his shoulders, right?" Taylor gushed. "Yeah," Grace mumbled, attention returning to the furry sandwich, inspecting it. She should be a qualified mycologist by now, thanks to Mum. Sliding the bag under her coat, she couldn't help but wonder if the doors through space-time were a bit like that Ziploc bag. "Could you be any less interested?" Taylor watched her friend blush. "They all look the same," she offered. Truth be told, everything paled in comparison to Mobius. All her thoughts seemed to lead back to it, and 87. But as that notion surfaced, the sample from the wall glanced over again, and Grace found herself unnervingly attuned to it. He looked like every other sample, covered in angular high-grade body armor and helmet, though he seemed aware of them, aware of her. More than that, he seemed to be listening, reacting. Memories of her move to Hydra flooded back, to the sample at the gate. Grace shook her head. She was beginning to sound ridiculous, even to herself. There were so many of them, and they were much too far away for anyone to hear. Besides, samples had far more important things to do than nosy in on Teen Talk. They certainly couldn't access her innermost thoughts. Their presence and mysterious identities must have sparked her overactive imagination. No one knew exactly what samples were capable of. "Not your type. Do you have a pulse?" Taylor practically shrieked as a wounded laugh escaped her red-headed friend. "Wait, there's someone else, isn't there? Spill Little Miss secrets." Grace's face burned as all eyes round the bench turned on her, and she watched Chico's expression fall. There wasn't anyone else, not in any real sense, although she did wonder if anyone could live up to her imagination, the feel of Mobius, or the company of 87. Arrogant as he was, he offered a fascinating take on this strange world and seemed to understand both it and her, connecting her back to universal truths and cycles, patterns and perspective. But they were her subconscious playing about with reality. She could hardly explain that to Taylor or anyone else for that matter. People already thought her odd. "Fine, have your secrets for now, Mrs. Leaves more samples for us." Taylor chuckled, turning to the other girls around the bench, who agreed, much to the disapproval of both Siko and Ewan. After lunch, Grace filed into science. Peering through the microscope, she watched the curious world inside a world, like a nesting doll. Molecular biology was fascinating. Studying DNA's classic double helix form, watching the DNA replication machine on the computer simulation, playing overhead as it unwound and unzipped itself for repair. Next up, they zoomed out to look at the whole chromosome. It copied itself and split in two. The dynamic scaffolding, where it met the chromosome, a signal broadcasting system, having indicated that it was ready for separation. The molecules were working in unison as a community, orchestrating healthy growth and separation. These little motor proteins, kinesin and others, seemed like little alien beings in this microscopic space, living inside her, and the idea struck Grace. What if people were like this little kinesin, part of a larger body, and what might happen should they deviate from their role, from their original coding? Given the troubles, she suspected they already knew the answer to that, having witnessed the collapse of a larger structure. The more she thought on, the more everything felt deeply connected, pattern, the symmetry and behavior. These tiny proteins, all parts of a larger structure, and all oblivious to the nesting dolls which contain them, and the greater function they support. She affectionately watched the little kinesin proteins, these miniature motorized machines transporting components inside people to support their cells' wider function. Protein 53, machine-like in its speed, fixing damaged DNA. Glancing at the lab footage of them moving in real time, they looked like stars twinkling in the night sky before dying out. Their little delicate life, crucial, beautiful, but a breath, and she wondered if it felt to them as though time passed more slowly for something so small. Microscopic particles move so fast compared to their size. The gravitational distortion of time had to weigh smaller on such things. Settling into her final lesson of the day, music, Grace searched the room for a place to hide. Their end-of-term solo was due, and despite her love of music, she was dreading it. Why couldn't they send in a pre-recorded performance? She loved music. It saturated everything, encompassed the spirit of polymath itself, but perform, no. She picked a seat at the back of the hall and shrank into it. Listening to the others perform, she felt rhythm splash, immersive color, and a variety of flavor over ideas, stories, and language. It seemed to distill pain and joy, mixing a recipe of intangible forces from the transcendent to craft something new and divine, enough to reprogram perspective and even one's molecular structure, uniting groups previously unconnected as well as birth something new in oneself. A modern miracle. But as the next song finished, shock bolt through her as they called her name. Lord, her turn. Grace's tiny frame and mop of red curls sat center stage, peering over the grand piano. Cashmere sleeves pulled as far over her skinny wrists and hands as they'd reach, while the piano stood to shield her on an otherwise naked stage. It was too quiet. Forcing out shaky breath, shouldering the weight of many eyes, her fingers began to dance over polished keys between black and white. Rhythm and rhyme swirled around, creating a vortex of ribboning tales, while order and madness spun structured threads of logic and lunacy, notes gently keying God's light touch through hearts and minds. Her rendition of Skylar Gray's Love the Way You Lie, as haunting as it was beautiful. Soon Grace found she was no longer in the room, but adrift, bathing in the flavor of notes, weightless and free. From 87's post along the perimeter wall, the scent of lyrics and melody from soft pink lips jarred his attention. He knew that voice well enough. It swept through Mobius, the softly spoken parody of artfully crafted word, between man and what is, hardening 87's crystal gaze. In a moment, his conscience sank into Mobius, surfacing in the hall. In song, its echo a haunting duet of transcendent forces. Lyric and rhyme spun the gyroscope of narrative, crafting maps and meaning. The vortex this created in Mobius was mesmerizing for those with eyes to see, though most could only feel it shaping the atmosphere. Living water and light manifest into strange shapes around her on stage. Its tornado, love, lies, and many rings with eyes. 87's narrowed on it. As Grace sang on, words heavied the atmosphere, and he began to make out moving images in the silent storm that followed. Grace's collage of people and their stories combined their genesis. The author's lyric and countless hertz rang out through her rising octave, a parody between man and God. 87's jaw firmed, glittering defiance smoldering in his eyes. As beautiful as it was, conviction dwarfed him. It wasn't a performance, it was a dance with the profound, an animation of relationships and reaction. Despite the pain in this perfect storm that flooded the stage, connecting them all, her voice remained gentle, warm. The same words felt by both parties carried vastly different meaning from where they joined in chorus. Their tornado, an uplifting collage of God, the fall of man and misunderstanding, opposing forces and perspectives, powerfully colliding in chorus, creating something delicate, unique, and utterly beautiful. The ultimate tragedy and romance between man and what is. In the swirls around her, 87 could make out moving images: torture, betrayal, war, murder, greed, and lies. A tragic average day in human history. But there amongst it all, he saw a flaming bush. Love, passion, and pain, all burning. Even angels had wicked schemes, while God's people took indifference and evil to new extremes, and yet her voice remained gentle, a whisper of grace from fundamental truths that rang out. Love the way you lie. Legatus in spilt from Grace's lips as the song drew to a close. He watched many lie down to rest, to access Mobius, the restorative wisdom and energy calming the storm and turning things around. 87 saw Dante most damned, those who lie, the lie itself betraying their desire to separate themselves from bad action and identify with something good. As delicate fingers began to still over black and white keys, the warmth of her breath and atmosphere began to dissipate. And as the last note stilled, she woke to the applause and standing ovation that broke out in the school hall. Chapter 17. Mind your own business, Grace snapped at 87's post-mortem of her recital as she strode out of class. Next time I could do it for you, he continued with a wicked grin. I've played with the best after all. Oh, how she wanted to wipe that smug expression from him. Ah, but as we've learned, he smirked, you don't have the talent for it. He watched her scarlet feathers ruffle beautifully, could almost feel the way the sun kissed her on that resin pathway, making him more than a little jealous of its reach. Forcing this critical ego from mind as best she could, Grace stared out across the quadrant for distraction. She could see Resnick on the other side, settling into practice. Ludus Bella was a brutal sport developed by Inter's Defense Department and had been adopted in most schools to weed out young talent. As tactical as chess, it used a mix of martial arts and rugby, turning the art of war into sport. All players held weapons assigned to role and rank, and wore body armor and helmets. These were coated in pressure pads and connected to mixed reality headsets. The overall aim of the game was to capture the other team's king, and when pressure pads indicated a fatality, the affected player would return to the bench, awarding points to the other team. There were 3 points for a pawn, 5 for a special, 10 for a queen, and 20 for a king. The game concluded when a king had been captured. She watched special players line up, either side of the king, with an array of various impressive weapons. They tended to focus on attacking the other team, knocking out the competition, and protecting pawns who focused on scoring points through goals. Pawns were only equipped with shields and moved on foot, while specials had dirt bikes, hybrids, and hoverboards. From the few games she'd seen, kings barked orders from their position through VR headsets, with tactical moves and high-impact hits projected onto large screens. Much to the crowd's excitement, spectators could experience hits firsthand using the right gear. Resnick made the team again? Taylor's eyes shone with mischief where she stood beside Grace. He's got a good seat. Her eyes glittered off him and the metallic hybrid he rode. Before the Troubles, Taylor had grown up on a farm and loved anything to do with animals, including Grace's brother, it seemed. We should hang out at yours more often, Taylor added with a wink, securing only a nervous laugh from Grace as she looped arms with her and strode toward the gate. You know, I'm beginning to think you're hiding something, Mrs. She eyed her red-headed friend as a warm voice beckoned from Pod Bay. Mum's here. The mischievous bounce in her eyes all but vanished as she glanced back at Grace. Look, I know you don't celebrate birthdays, Kaz. Well, you're a superstitious nut or something. So, happy Friday. she smiled, handing over a small ribbon bag. If you need, I can hang about. Have you stay at mine this weekend if— And miss the competition? Grace shook her head. I want to see that trophy. Taylor bounced back with a hug of such force that Grace felt her goodbye gush out. Watching Taylor hurry into the arms of her mum, Grace pottered off alone to find her own pod, opening the small blue box as she went. It held a miniature polyphone, a mechanical music box, its wooden case presenting beautifully carved images of cherubs and Greek gods, along with a set of 3 tiny metal discs. Its contents like a map of sorts, each disc a song, an algorithm, able to transport the listener somewhere else. She'd have loved to spend the weekend at Taylor's, but Taylor had worked so hard to get to the finals of Inter's annual gymnastic competition. Besides, as far as birthdays went, they felt pretty unlucky, and Grace felt relieved if they slipped by largely unnoticed, which wouldn't happen if Taylor were around. A smile tugged at her glum expression, where she glanced up just in time to see the sample who turned into her. Grace braced for impact that never came. Behind his helmet, 87's eyes narrowed, a sort of tonic immobility having struck. Quite how he didn't know and certainly didn't wish to dwell on. But in person, right here, he saw the culmination of every moment in a way he'd never experienced, not even in Mobius. Grace glanced up from his badge. It read, Sample 87, but he abruptly turned and left. It was just as well, she decided. If he hadn't, she would no doubt have blurted out something ridiculous about the coincidence. Slumping into her pod, wondering what on earth could have possibly caused their presence at school, she watched him send other samples to the gate before he strode inside without a second glance. Taylor and the others had settled on the idea that Harrow was assisting Inter with tech development, but the guy she'd seen marching to the head's office gave the impression he was on the warpath, and the teachers certainly seemed on edge. To her, it didn't seem like a friendly visit at all. Samples that moved through the halls seemed to be looking for something. A spy, perhaps? Stolen data? Her imagination whirled into action. What if Harrow harbored some deep, dark secret that they knew nothing about? A secret society, perhaps? Or a rebellion against Inter? The pages of history were littered with secret societies, particularly in academic circles. Excitement bubbled at the edge of her imagination, thoughts washing back over the day till they snagged once more on Sample 87. What if he were real? Not just real to her, but here in the flesh. Given the rumors about Sample's abilities and origin, it was unlikely they were human. They were far more like machines. And with AI and VR, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility for him to seem human enough. She thought of the sample at the gate. His presence was oddly familiar. But her eyes rolled off hover drones and smart material skyscrapers that flashed by as she forced out a sigh. Honestly, she scolded, an imaginary friend at her age really was pushing the limits of sanity. It was time to grow up. She resolved not to think of 87 anymore. More than that, grabbing the little security droid from where he hovered overhead, she switched him off and put him away in her bag. No more. No more pretending creature comforts were companions. City gardens flashed by, and by the time her pod pulled up at home, she was fully committed to task. When Taylor was back, she'd meet up with her and the others. No more hiding away in her room, no more daydreaming, no more pretend. To her surprise, Mum's pod was already in the drive, and the realization struck. The sandwiches. She forgot to dispose of them. Her eyes flicked to the tall fence at the boundary, thoughts turning to its owner, old Mrs. Rose. She was a grumpy old woman, as thorny as her name suggested, and despite her many wrinkles, had no smile lines whatsoever. Her distaste for nature had long robbed the old woman of any desire to explore her beautifully large garden. Grace felt her heart leap. It was lined with thick rhododendrons. She never thought she'd say this, but thank God for old Mrs. Rose. There was no way she'd find those rotten sandwiches. Slipping the Ziploc bag over the fence, Grace felt the weight of the world lift, the pat of its fall like one on the back. Standing on the porch, waiting for the front door to scan the network of capillaries in her hand, it gave a friendly bleep and clicked open. She was surprised to find no sign of Mum. She expected to find her in the kitchen, or coming out of the lounge ready to air whatever grievance had kept her from the spa, but the house was eerily quiet. Dad's work lay abandoned on the kitchen counter. Then it came from upstairs, a sound that cut right through her, the sheen of cold steel between each heavy thud. Chapter 18. From behind the door to her parents' room, Grace watched Mum plunge a knife into something beside the bed. Easing the door open a little further, she realized it was only Dad's file, his work file. But as the door slowed, it let out a treacherous whine, a tattletale that spun Mum's head. Her eyes burning pits black as coal, where they fell on Grace, whose gaze shot to the knife. "You!" Mum barked. Heart racing in her ears, Grace sprinted up to her room, shutting the door. "You're just like him!" Mum thundered after her. Grace pulled her floating shelf off the wall, wedging it behind her door in the wall, barring entry. It cracked open as Mum overrode the lock, bearings crunching and grinding. It jammed. Unable to drag the sliding door back, Mum rammed into it before hammering again at the electronics panel outside, demanding Grace open up. "You're just like him! You're just like that arsehole!" she screamed. "Running away, refusing to talk, son of a bitch! Open up, I said!" The door buckled where she rammed it again. "Well, you tell him. It would have been him if he were here." Grace slumped down on the other side of the cupboard, heart far outpacing the hammering her door had taken. "Open up, selfish son of a bitch! Damn it!" Sliding on some old-fashioned headphones, Grace curled up on the floor, eyes squeezing shut as the sound of Mum began to fade to the overlay of music that pulled her from her room to a place no one could reach her. Except 87, it seemed. She saw him almost instantly. Usually he was a welcome distraction, but right now it felt to her as though her very world was caving in. As though 87 himself were a sign of just how bad things had got. The ability to conjure up invisible friends like a rabbit from a hat and to exist almost entirely in a place that did not. Friend? 87 correct. Plural. His eyes darkened with a wry smile. And no one conjures me. Besides, collate me to a rabbit again, and you won't have an invisible friend to worry about. Grace hadn't expected to laugh, but his indignation lit an evanescent one that bubbled out of her nose, one she wiped back with her sleeve. "Ironic they called you Grace, isn't it?" he continued as though helpful. "You are many things," he mused, jaw firming. "Skinny, annoying, slow on the uptake. A mess, really. But relax, you're not mad." "Says my invisible friend," Grace sobbed, wiping away tears. "You overestimate yourself if you think you could invent me." 87 sobered as a realization struck. If she were the source code, there might actually be some truth to it. Shaking that little complication from mind, he drawled on. "I'm in your head, not part of you. You might be special." He eyed her with surprising warmth. "But you're not that special." He watched something sparkle up from the depths of emerald pools close to thanks, before those long lashes shuddered. "She hates me. The one person biologically programmed to love me and—" Her lips pressed firm, swallowing the logical conclusion that followed. "The green-eyed monster." 87 gave a thoughtful nod, but Grace shook her head. "She has everything." People dress up as the emperor with no clothes on and parade all flavors of insecure, born from a lack of connection to fundamentals. The hardwiring your mum developed to judge others is the only one she has to judge herself. 87 watched as years of carefully constructed assumption, this sandcastle of opinions, washed out of Grace. She can't enjoy the oasis because its beauty appears a threat, a judge. So bit by bit she destroys it, and with that, the place on which she depends. People like that reliably create the hell they one day wake in. One filled with nothing of substance. 87's expression sobered. People have been encouraged to substitute connection for consumption, truth for pride, and the real for the artificial. But everyone feels its pull toward the natural, the truth, and the beautiful, his voice laced with frustration, gaze washing over her. For a moment, Grace thought she felt an unusual air of vulnerability about him, but he convinced her otherwise as he moved along with a shrug. Those on high-class drugs find themselves able to reconnect to it, through Mobius, to gaze through the curtain and experience a fraction of its effect as the drug alters neuropathways, allowing drips of energy and euphoria from Mobius to leak through. Many get lost in it, unable or unwilling to come back. 87's mouth pressed firm as he felt her own longing to return there, to escape her unhappy situation in Mobius. "Come," He gestured for her to follow, knowing just where to take her. "You'll like this." Scooping up her hand when she failed to move, he strode through another door in Mobius. It opened as though an eye, overlooking 13th century Italy. From where they stood at the back of a gondola, bobbing about, salt water matted his hair. Sweeping it back, 87 watched Grace rise out of her little pity party on the spirit of adventure and intrigue. They wove through what appeared a floating city with meandering river roads, spiced with salt and other exotic spices from around the world. Wooden bridges arched overhead, commanding they bow every so often, unless they wish to be thrown into the water. Palaces with towering spires and narrow alleys decorate side streets, which echoed with vibrant personalities. But Grace's attention was fixed on the passenger in front as the walls of his 13th century home drew close. Grabbing his physician's bag, the man jumped out, hurrying along the jetty and up steep steps to scoop up a little girl who came to greet him. "Young Christine de Pizan," 87 explained, hopping out the boat and offering Grace a hand. Though they were there and the boat responded to the move, as in Greece, no one appeared able to see them. It was a wonder, Grace marveled, still getting used to the feel of it. "We're in Venice?" With a nod, 87 strode after the man. The city, like the man, a rising power out of humble beginnings, mud and water, among cutthroats and beauty. It was obvious to see the man's daughter was the apple of his eye. Her mother died. Christine was just 4 years old and her father in the process of moving them to Paris, having just received confirmation of his appointment as the king's astrologer. They watched as civil unrest rose and swirled up around the state of Venice before their move to Paris. The girl's years passed in moments as she grew up in France's royal court, raised among the very accomplished. "Notice anything?" Grace glanced about the opulent court of Charles V. 87 was clearly looking for something profound. "They're wearing pajamas." She smiled, much to his annoyance. "She doesn't fit in." His mouth thinned as he skirted her over the tops of crowds to focus on Christine and through the flickering pages of late 13th century history in Mobius. They flew through decorative, immersive stills as though Orson Welles and Grace saw France, its wealthy populace in Western Europe, now under great strain, decades into their 100-year war with England. Edward III, having stake claim to the French throne, and while defending France in battle, their King John II had been taken hostage. As a result, France had lost around a third of its land in the treaty that followed. Christine's father, France's newly appointed court astrologer, began advising the king's son, Charles V, right away on matters such as negotiations with the English and how best to proceed, turning the tide. Charles soon declared war, and by the time Christine was 14, her father had helped France to recover most of their land that had been taken in the Treaty of Bretigny. Grace watched this young teenager, in a culture her father battled to rescue, surrounded by the greatest minds of her time, and their chatter in France's royal court. "Women are the gateway to hell," Tertullian chortled, quickly followed by another. "Seducers, playthings, not to be taken seriously, not in any real sense," Gerard de Moon agreed. Christine watched and listened with interest. It didn't take her long to realize that most minds were not great or well kept, even in this royal court. Far from it. All too often she found them neglected, or worse, left entirely abandoned. Most stately minds, while able to parrot a few lively mottos, were never able to extrapolate or apply them. And though these mottos were able to give the impression that the lights were on and somebody home, the speaker's behavior revealed a miserable state of affairs inside. She was careful to follow ideas to their logical conclusion and weigh truth with bias. Thoughts, words, and this mixing of worlds at court began to knit a colorful tapestry in her mind. Opinions, fact and fiction, all tumbled about, refining and polishing her perspective. Her father loved and encouraged her, teaching her much, from astrology to medicine and politic. They exchanged many letters over the years, in a language derived from cryptography. Riddles and puzzles he'd used to keep her entertained while away. Christine's years passed in Grace's moments, and she saw the beautiful 15-year-old grow up to marry a fine young man, Etienne. He loved her, and the two did all they could to bring out the best in one another. He encouraged Christine to write daily, refining her thought on matters of interest, and in her diary, in this hidden dialect refined by her and her father, she began to do just that, filling it with notes, beginning with herbal health. She noted how women were like medicinal roots of a plant. They played a vital role for those they fed and nourished, often unseen but crucial to life, growth, stability, and the healthy development of society. She wrote another section on astrology, wisdom her father passed on, and her own insights. The second half, inspired by the frustration of ill-informed prejudice, she continued to experience at court from those claiming to represent the brightest minds of Europe. Using reason, rectitude, and the notion of justice, she began to dispel myths and misogyny in a language they'd understand, in legal terms they valued. There, she ironed out her early thinking on matters of importance, sketching women in Roman baths, making business connections and decisions. But as her father became sick, she returned to researching and noting down pharmacological treatments to help him. Grace watched Christine's heartbreak as he later died, and within a year, so too had her husband, from plague. Chapter 19. Grace could feel Christine's grief, more so, the comfort she found in her children, and the strength she drew from writing. Grace recognized the feeling well enough. In those moments, Christine's mind reconnected with what is. The heavens would open, offering counsel and strength when she needed it most. But with 3 children to support and no other income, she traveled, accepting commissions for writing and poetry. While away, her cryptographic diary was one of the many items that disappeared from her husband's estate as she struggled to reclaim it along with the rest of her inheritance. While she eventually succeeded, she never saw her cryptographic diary again, but the ideas on equality which it helped to develop formed the basis for one of her most profound works, The City of Ladies. Her books went on to be commissioned by global leaders, kings, princes, and princesses, passing on divine wisdom. What happened to it? Her diary, Grace asked, was found many years later in Europe and became known as the Voynich manuscript. The undecipherable text. 87 nodded with a wry smile. Thought you'd like that. She was a pioneer, and the first professional troll. Drove men crazy with all those pictures of naked women in baths, alongside a text no man could decipher despite their superior talk. Only to have the refined ideas published all along. Grace looked at the book, The City of Ladies, in a language they understood. She smiled as her consciousness returned to her room and sank back into her form where it lay, curled up on the floor. Some will dedicate their lives in the pursuit of what they cannot understand, ignoring the significance of what they do, missing the point in either. 87's brow pinched as Grace gave an unladylike yawn. Her consciousness safely back in her body, Grace's curiosity clung to it as sleep blanketed her, easing her grip on the finite and the afternoon light that filled her room. It seemed as if no time at all had passed since they entered Mobius. Funny thing, consciousness, she breathed, curiosity still stretching out, reaching for answers even as she drifted off. Makes you wonder, Grace continued with another wide yawn, flaring tiny nostrils. About everything. It seemed to Grace that consciousness saturated everything on a metaphysical level, and that Mobius connected it all, sustaining fundamentals and with it, life. There were life forms which conducted its restorative energy between the metaphysical and physical, thousands at a microscopic level and millions visible to the naked eye. Following that pattern, there were perhaps billions at a macroscopic level. A Russian doll of energy, rippling and expanding out from the source of what is, the very big manifested in the very small. All beings connected but confined out of necessity to their respective domain which they oversaw, like particles and bonding, from macroscopic beings that ordered the night sky, to humans that worked the earth and the cells in their bodies, to atoms, polarity and bonding sustaining fundamentals. Those furthest from the nucleus of the universe, the central processing unit, this heart of the fundamental of what is, had the most energy proportional to their task, while those close held more resemblance to this life-giving force. All were important, all tasked with sustaining fundamental parameters, and with it, life. 87 listened to her thoughts roll out. He'd seen things in Mobius, at its outer edge, reach in. The celestial from the fringe, leaving its domain, forming bonds outside of it, bonds that behaved badly. Drifting further into the realms of sleep, Grace felt as though she lay on a blanket so comfortable she could no longer feel it as, from within Mobius, 87 picked her up. From in her room, her body rose up from the floor and hovered midair before floating towards her bed where it settled. What else is there? Grace sighed, snuggling into the blanket that pressed her cheek. It was so big they couldn't be the only ones. The truth was, 87 wasn't quite sure. He had seen a great many things, not all of which he could explain. There were others, many others sharing this overlapping space, more diverse than physical reality could paint. Many were not constrained to any form, nor did they pass typical generational lines, and they varied in temperament as much as in their fluctuating appearance. There were those who seemed rather harmless, those who had been unwittingly sucked into Mobius and were struggling to find their way back, many on prescribed or illicit narcotics, which opened doors in their mind they hadn't known were there. He'd also encountered those lost in comas, and then there were those who appeared to have used Mobius to connect to fundamental order, directly to what is, to its wisdom. They were bright. They were very annoying. In truth, he did his best to avoid them. Grace, there's something you should know. Grace. But she'd sunk out of reach into a deep sleep. From behind the curtain of space-time, 87 brushed red curls from her face and watched her rest a moment. Her oddities and freckles, her red hair and clumsy charm, even the bump in her nose from where her mother had broken it as a baby, highlighted a beauty in her, so intense it pained him. From Mobius, he held back the noise from where her mother continued to hammer away at the door, allowing her time to rest. As she slept on, Grace puzzled over it, this common theme in every thread, enabling it to weft to the warp of space-time. From the crossroads of Mobius, she saw the attributes at work, a calling, an inner conviction driving one forward, stitching their lifeline to Mobius. All of a sudden, she stopped. It had to be some sort of mistake. Mobius had taken her down a very different path, and 87 was now nowhere to be seen. Glancing up, she came to a stop. It was like watching a home video of her as a kid, but somewhere she never remembered being. She hovered behind the curtain of space and time, gawking at her young, freckled face with glittering green eyes and curly red mop of hair. "Come on, Velda," a young voice called, from where Grace wasn't sure. She simply stared in disbelief. Velda King. The Velda King. The woman who'd established Inter, their global technocracy. Grace pictured the stoic, middle-aged woman. She was, of course, much older now and blonde. Yet here she was, a tiny red-headed kid that looked almost identical to her. Grace couldn't believe it when moments later what appeared to be her twin bound in. By all appearance, Annika appeared a carbon copy of Velda, though far more confident. Zooming out, Grace checked their location. Mobius had taken them back to the year 2030, overlooking the outskirts of a small rural English town near Cannock Chase, shortly before the world fell apart. The resemblance was uncanny. Hovering there a moment, she zoomed in to overlay her DNA and genetic structure. Velda King, or her twin Annika, her mother? Chapter 20. Rolling eyes, Grace zoomed back out. The weight of her ego, for her imagination to claim such. Then again, she paused. Her imagination was just doing what it always had, protecting itself, pretending there were other reasons for her mistreatment. Rather than admit she was just unlovable, she supposed it made sense for the subconscious to protect the ego. That was all it was doing. Trying to explain it wasn't her fault. Although the twins looked identical, they couldn't be more different. Velda was very much like Grace, cautious, quiet, and reserved. Her twin, on the other hand, bound about like an excited puppy, and Grace found herself feeling somewhat envious of their surroundings. There was no dome hanging overhead, no protection, and fresh air pinked their cheeks. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, heavenly. Crystal blue waters, lush green meadows and tall pines stretching skyward, and the sound. She couldn't remember anything like it. Hydra had managed to recreate most things, had even begun to reintroduce birds to the first, but here nature's harmony sang with a richness and depth that the first still lacked. Returning to the girls, she listened carefully. Annika's wide green eyes now peeked out the window of the Wendy hut. "Coast clear?" She pulled out their meta-goggles and slung a pair at Velda, gaze flicking about the room before settling on Grace. Velda's brow furrowed. You think Nannybot knows? No, I thought. Annika stood, and instead of opening the Wendy hut, she examined the far corner before returning to her beanbag. Nothing. But Grace could see it didn't feel like nothing to her, her eyes fixed to where Grace floated behind the curtain of space and time. Finally, with a shake of her head, she slumped into the beanbag. Never mind. We should bring them back. Velda sighed, nerves getting the better of her. Nanny said fresh air. Annika grinned, opening a window. And Dad always said, efficiency isn't a state, but a state of mind. Grace watched them slide on meta glasses and load Dirtbird avatars before zooming through the portal. Green spirals swirled round them before dropping the two girls, plummeting through the pink and purple skies of Derpatonia. Annika was a buff derp warrior about to defeat the Pred army. Velda, on the other hand, was about to be sick. Later that evening, defeated, Velda flopped back against her bedroom wall. She should never have listened to Annika. Should have known better. As things stood, time had flown in the metaverse as it always did. They hadn't shown for lunch, and Nannybot had caught them red-handed with their meta contraband. Velda sighed as her shoe tapped the wall. Sat in separate rooms with piles of homework to keep them out of trouble and absorb that creative energy, according to Nannybot. Combing through those endless pages, she resigned to the fact she'd never finish them all and would never see her beloved meta goggles again. Meanwhile, next door, Grace could see Annika had already discarded the pile of homework and instead focused on finishing alterations to her clunky Roblox. It was, after all, advertised as the ultimate assistant designed to manage everything. Annika, however, had noticed that the manufacturers had overlooked one critical function, homework. But thanks to these alterations and a small update, she'd managed to overcome that little oversight. It scanned her homework before bleeping and blopping answers on the page. Sitting back with a satisfied smile, she realized she could probably speed the process up by having it hover a little higher to complete multiple pages at once. I could lend it to Velda. We'll be done before bed. Annika jumped to her feet and cranked up its thruster, at which point wet and dry pages flew into the air like a tornado. Dancing about the room, trying to catch them, she knocked over her cup. Water and ink ran over the floor, turning crisp cellulose fibers to goo. Unfortunately, the mess reactivated Roblox's original housekeeping function, and it began hoovering up the gooey pages. Soon the machine buzzed and whirled frantically as fans revved and thrusters blew pages wildly about the room in its attempt to free the obstruction, a ball of soggy papers now tightly wedged inside one hose. Remaining thrusters whirled wildly into action, trying to free the blockage. Higher and higher the thing rose as its little engine began to smoke. Annika, meanwhile, had scrambled on top of her cabin bed and launched herself unceremoniously through the air. Landing on top of the thing, red curls spun as the machine began to slow, sinking toward the floor under the additional weight while she rummaged for the manual override. Before she could reach it, however, its little engine exploded, throwing her back in a cloud of black smoke and splatter of sparks, ink and goop. It left a perfect stencil, a frizzy mop and tiny frame where she sat propped against the wall. Fire alarms were screaming where she blinked back at smoke and sparks, trying to make out the fruits of her labor. Coughing and spluttering, she crawled to a window that had sprung open, thanks to a housekeeping app Dad had installed as Nannybot burst in. Spraying a dry powder over everything, the fire sparked and simmered out, her late mum's voice spilling over the speaker as silicone arms from Nanny wrapped protectively round her. Harsh words and warm memories flooded back in the lecture that followed, while Annika stared at the few mangled pages which survived. It had worked. Well, sort of. Fast-forwarding to the following morning, Grace could see the girls sneak out after breakfast. Making their way up round the south wall, they skipped over autonomous grass cutters and dashed past the old groundsman's house, which had now been converted to house a backup generator and battery store for the drones who worked the estate. Just beyond the thicket stood the old brick boundary. Its walls stood tall, at almost double their height, and, even though winter, it was unseasonably hot. Placing her sweater over the wall, Annika scrambled up and peered into their old neighbor's orchard, eyes glistening. Dad said he used to let the whole village in. Nowadays he locks the gate. Her expression soured on the old man's house, as Velda's head popped up beside her own. Why? Obviously he wants them all to himself. She eyed the large pink ladies that decorate the orchard. There were so many. No, Annika! Velda snatched at her twin, who jumped onto the gnarly old branch that bounced where it overhung the wall. That grumpy old man's nowhere to be seen. Annika threw back, evading capture. See, she grinned, once perched at the top, enjoying a large apple. No harm done. Taking another bite, she swung her legs merrily. They're so good! Velda hovered at the wall, Mum's voice replaying in her mind. She needs you to set a good example. They're healthy. Annika grinned as she swung upside down on the branch and dangled there a moment. He can't possibly eat them all. Velda scrambled up over the old brick wall, knuckles whitening on a neighboring branch as she stared down. The ground had begun to spin beneath her, till Annika's hand reached out, eyes sparkling with confidence Velda longed for. Helping her up and handing over an apple, Annika caught sight of the old man, who was now hobbling down the garden path, waving his stick wildly at them. Velda followed Annika where she scrambled down, fast as she could, only to hear a chilling scream. There on the branch below, a large snake had sunk its teeth into Annika, who fell out of the tree. Tumbling after her, Velda stumbled to her feet. The last thing Annika could remember was the burning. Her hand felt as though it was on fire. The old man charged overhead at the tree, scaring the snake away before glaring down at her. "Don't you kids ever listen?" he growled, glossy eyes full of concern as she lost consciousness. Chapter 21. Mum would have known what to do. From in Mobius, Grace could feel Annika's pain where she lay in hospital, in a medically induced coma, resenting everything, from the old man to the fundamentals that underpinned their very existence. They all seemed to conspire against her, take away everything meaningful, everything precious, even Mum. "What makes you think I'm not here?" Annika found herself in her mother's arms, felt maternal warmth and that whimsical personality she loved so much wrap round. "'Cause you're not," she snapped, clinging to the interaction just the same. "Some things you only see when you close your eyes and can only action at rest. You will always carry part of me with you." Meanwhile, Velda faced Dad's anger and disapproving looks. They'd nearly lost Annika that day. "I've lost enough," he choked beside her hospital bed. "Your mother would have wanted you to protect her. She needs you. I need you. To be responsible." That day, Nanny Bot was switched off and placed in the attic. By the time Annika returned from hospital, Velda had already been sent away. They were placed in separate boarding schools. Dad had explained they needed space to grow up, to become their own people. In the early days, Velda cried a lot. The guilt, crushing. Grace could see she tried to blame Annika, but in truth carried that burden. In a sense, she'd lost the rest of her family that day. It scattered them, changed them forever. Returning home on holidays only seemed to highlight their now irreconcilable differences. She'd have given anything to go back, to do things differently, but perhaps it was for the best. She knew Dad was trying to protect them. And as the years passed, she threw herself into her studies, clung to rules and regulation like a lifeline, found comfort in familiarity, predictability, and planning. At school, she worked hard, got good grades, and followed in her parents' footsteps in computer science and coding, securing a role overseas as a software engineer in Belarus. Having worked closely with the British embassy there, she went on to land several other overseas secondments for governmental departments, and as global tensions rose and trouble broke out, she became one of the youngest recruits at Special Branch. Several months in, she sat scanning reports, had never known anything like it. There had never been this type of attack, such utter devastation, not on any page of history. Global civil war erupted so fast, no government had time to react. Nowhere was safe, nowhere was spared. It was utter bloody chaos. The air about her small partition office was stale and still, but her eyes still shone with hope. She knew she could help, undo some of the damage they now faced, help restore trust in local government, if she only tried hard enough, worked long enough, dedicate herself completely. She pioneered what the agency had come to dub the Voice of Reason, a VR campaign by Special Branch to reignite a sense of patriotism and community. Annika, on the other hand, never quite settled. Although she regretted the fallout from that fateful day, it was impossible to regret making what she saw as the best possible decision, given the limited information she had available at the time. she hadn't known the danger in the garden. If she had, she obviously wouldn't have gone there. It had been many years since that day, and although Dad worked hard to provide for them, Grace could see that Annika felt incredibly angry towards him. He'd sent them away, and yet chose to maintain a large empty house for children he never saw, and seemed to feel he were in some way providing the best for his kids. But then grown-ups were a little strange in that respect. It seemed to her their perspective deteriorated before the rest of their senses. Annika felt sure that it was only in thinking outside the box, which was largely shaped by shifting social tide, that anyone could hope to solve the problems they'd been led blindly into. As years rolled by, Grace could see Annika continued challenging both rules and ideals of the school she attended, organizing protests, petitioning the deans, and causing no end of headaches for the school board. While behind the scenes and unbeknown to her, Grace saw her father's countless visits to the school in order to appease the trouble caused and to ensure Annika's future in continued learning. Although she was also a natural at computer analytics like her father, she focused her studies on art, theology, and philosophy of religion. And while she didn't really fit in at school, she felt very much at home exploring their old library, a place where even her mind would grow strangely quiet. In their 20s, when the twins did spend any length of time together, how they argued. They disagreed on virtually everything from politics to the way Dad's funeral plans should be carried out after cluster munitions tore through their village back home. In the chaos of global civil war, Annika busied herself volunteering at local hospitals and led the charge in several activist groups, each a reinvention of the last quashed resistance. Velda, on the other hand, busied herself at Special Branch, fighting to preserve what little remained of law and order. She and the few other staff that remained now lived on site, fighting a losing battle. Exhausted, she dropped her keys on the side, sliding their family portrait into a drawer and pottering through to her kitchenette, which consisted of a microwave and countertop. Placing her pile of briefs down, she warmed some soup and drank from the bowl, warming icy fingers to rifle through the first file under the soft glow of a lamp. They had one remaining generator at Wadsden Manor, Special Branch's last surviving stronghold. Since global civil war erupted, their numbers had dwindled at pace with armed forces and rations. From behind the curtain of space-time, Grace felt the weight on Velda's shoulders. Despite her best efforts, things had only gone from bad to worse. Even the seasons had changed, become more extreme, and it seemed Mother Nature herself had turned her back on them. Months later, as Velda sat at her desk, paging through yet more reams of transcripts in the dusty light of day, the wanted hologram of Alessandro Visser, Alice for short, flickered on the wall. He was an infamous cypherpunk and Special Branch's most wanted. His latest leak of classified documents, although eye-opening, couldn't have come at a worse time. True or not, they threatened national security, undermining faith in authority structures when it was most needed. Law and order had already begun to crumble when he released them, and now, thanks to prolonged unrest and the level of mistrust in government, things looked hopeless. Every global system governing law and order had either fallen or, like Special Branch, was on its last legs, battling back crime syndicates and opportunistic vultures that began to swoop in. Velda's attention returned to the file in front. Despite many of their technical advances, they'd been forced to return to paper records thanks to hacks and their limited power supply. Right now, it wasn't just crime syndicates like the Volkov they had to watch out for. From inside Mobius, this living tapestry, Grace could see uncensored history play out. As Special Branch and other governmental forces weakened, their enemies grew. Local rebels fanned the flames of civil unrest that erupted across the globe, hoping for change, while from the shadows syndicates lit more, monopolizing on those who took aim at the very structures built to protect them. Then there was the private sector to consider, most notably, the notorious mercenary group Silvergate. The Silvergate Mercenary Corp, or SMC as they referred to themselves, was notorious. A highly skilled collective of hired guns. They weren't directly attacking government holdings yet, but they had begun to seize key strategic locations that had been overrun by crime syndicates and not return them to their prospective governments once liberated. The SMC had argued it was due to local governments' inability to provide adequate defense, but it was a clear and strategic land grab, a way to monopolize and profit from civil unrest. The SMC were incredibly difficult to locate unless you believe they spent hours in Discord discussing NFTs or planning to chase oversized wheels of cheese downhill. Velda punched off the Discord app where memes of beans had been replaced by chair disasters, overtaking both the channel and her patience. With a sigh, her finger and thumb pressed the bridge of her nose as she leant over her desk. The device's special branch were now monitoring clearly never did or no longer belonged to SMC members. They were likely burners, plants aimed at tying up her limited time and resource. Bloody chair, waste of time and all she had to go on. Velda froze. Chair? Jumping to her feet, she scanned the array of photos on the memorial wall of those presumed dead in the field. Her gaze fixed on one of the top pictures. Underneath lay a small gold plaque, which read, Tom Chair. They had to have people on the inside. Of course, that was how they evade Special Branch. As food and means dwindled here, they weren't losing record numbers in the field. Record numbers were jumping ship. Bastards. Good looking, wasn't he? Alice chirped over her shoulder as she eyed the photo. But that's all they had time for. Everything happened so fast and yet all rolled out in slow motion, seared to Velda's memory. An explosion ripped through HQ, decimating UK intelligence. Velda's desk had been her home the last few years. The files that went up in smoke contained her entire existence, turned to dust in a moment. She lay there buried in rubble, ears ringing, broken bones and every cell in her crying out to the ether, rippling through the consensus where Grace float, watching in horror. Grace paled as the dust settled. From where she stilled behind the curtain of space-time, Velda's lifeline could be seen, preserved in Mobius from where Grace watched, but within it, the energy linking past, present, and future began to flicker out. Grace couldn't begin to fathom the implications. A sense of rising panic gripped her. Energy inside the lifeline was subject to the fundamentals of time which exist within it, but not out here with her. Her head spun with its implications. This change to the past, what it would mean for them all. As she struggled with calculations, a jolt of light punched through her, propelling her up against the fabric of space-time and the curtain separating them, to Velda where she lay reaching out to the consensus.